In the shadowed halls of Thornwick Palace, where centuries of royal secrets echo through marble corridors, a single piece of jewelry would ignite the most explosive confrontation the monarchy had witnessed in decades. The Duchess of Ravensholm thought her midnight alterations would remain hidden forever. She was wrong. When Prince Alexander discovered what his stepmother had done to his late mother's most precious heirloom, the legendary Avalon sapphire ring, the gloves came off in a way that would shake the very foundations of the crown. What started as a family dispute over jewelry would evolve into a battle for the soul of the kingdom itself, with loyalties tested, secrets exposed, and the future of the royal lineage hanging in the balance. Prince Alexander Edward Thornwick stood at the towering windows of his private study, watching the morning mist roll across the ancient grounds of Thornwick Palace. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from knowing he would one day wear the crown. But today, something felt different. The weight of responsibility seemed heavier, more pressing, as if the very stones of the palace were whispering warnings he couldn't quite understand. The palace had been his home for all his life, yet recently it felt more like a fortress under siege. Ever since his father, King Harold, had married Victoria Ashworth 3 years ago, the dynamics within the royal family had shifted dramatically. Victoria, now the Duchess of Ravensholm, had arrived with impeccable credentials, aristocratic bloodline, and a smile that could charm diplomats and commoners alike. But Alexander had never been fooled by surface appearances. His late mother, Queen Isabella, had possessed a rare combination of grace and steel that had made her beloved by the people and respected by world leaders. She had died in a tragic car accident when Alexander was 22, leaving behind a legacy of compassion and a collection of jewelry that held not just monetary value, but deep emotional significance for the royal family. Among these treasures, the Avalon sapphire ring stood supreme, a magnificent piece featuring a 12-carat Ceylon sapphire surrounded by diamonds passed down through 7 generations of queens. Alexander's phone buzzed against the mahogany desk, interrupting his contemplation. The caller ID showed his younger sister, Princess Charlotte, calling from her residence at Millbrook Estate. "Alexander, you need to get to the vault immediately." Charlotte's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "I was reviewing Mother's jewelry collection for the upcoming memorial exhibition when I noticed something disturbing." "What kind of disturbing?" Alexander straightened, recognizing the tone his sister used when she was about to deliver devastating news. "The Avalon sapphire ring. It's been altered. Someone has removed the original sapphire and replaced it with what appears to be a synthetic stone. The setting has been modified, and the inscription inside the band has been partially filed away." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. The Avalon sapphire wasn't just jewelry. It was a symbol of the monarchy's continuity, a tangible link to their heritage. Their mother had worn it during every major state function, and it was intended to be passed to Alexander's future wife when he married. "Are you absolutely certain?" he asked, though he knew Charlotte's expertise in gemology made mistakes unlikely. "I've had it examined by 3 independent experts. There's no doubt. The original sapphire has been replaced with a high-quality synthetic, but the historical value and authenticity are completely destroyed. The question is, who did this and why?" Alexander felt a cold fury building in his chest. Only a select few people had access to the royal vault, and each entry was meticulously logged. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't let anyone else near that collection." As he strode through the palace corridors toward the royal vault, Alexander's mind raced through the possibilities. The vault required 2 keys to open, one held by the Lord Chamberlain and another by a member of the immediate royal family. All entries were recorded, with security footage from multiple angles. This wasn't a random theft, it was an inside job requiring detailed knowledge and careful planning. The royal vault lay 3 levels beneath the palace's east wing, behind doors that had protected the crown jewels and royal treasures for over 2 centuries. Alexander's footsteps echoed in the stone corridor as he approached the reinforced entrance, where Princess Charlotte waited with Lord Chamberlain Edmund Blackwood. "Your Highness?" Blackwood bowed slightly, his weathered face grave with concern. "I've pulled the access logs for the past 6 months. There have been 12 authorized entries, all properly documented and witnessed." Charlotte held up a magnifying glass over the ring, her expert eye examining every detail. "Look at this," she said, pointing to tiny scratch marks around the setting. "These are fresh tool marks. Whoever did this was skilled, but they left evidence. The original setting was crafted by master jeweler Cornelius Hartwell in 1847. His technique was distinctive. These modern modifications are obvious once you know what to look for." Alexander examined the ring under the magnifying glass, seeing the evidence his sister had discovered. The synthetic sapphire was beautiful, but it lacked the unique inclusions and color variations that made the original stone legendary. More troubling was the partially filed inscription, which had originally read, "Forever United in Love, Isabella and Harold, 1989, his parents' wedding date." "Who has accessed the vault in the past month?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Blackwood consulted his tablet. 3 entries. Princess Charlotte, twice for inventory purposes, myself once for routine inspection, and the Duchess of Ravensholm once, 2 weeks ago. She said she wanted to familiarize herself with the royal collection for an upcoming charity auction. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander felt his jaw clench as the implications became clear. Victoria had not just stolen a piece of jewelry, she had desecrated his mother's memory and violated the trust of the royal family. But he needed proof, and he needed to understand her motivation. "I want to see the security footage from her visit," Alexander commanded. "And I want a complete analysis of this ring by the Royal Jeweller's Office. Document everything." Over the next several hours, as experts confirmed what Charlotte had discovered, Alexander watched the security footage with growing amazement and anger. The cameras showed Victoria entering the vault with Blackwood, who had left her alone for several minutes while he attended to paperwork in the adjacent office. During those minutes, Victoria had moved with purpose and efficiency, going directly to Isabella's collection and removing the Avalon sapphire ring from its case. The footage was damning, but it raised more questions than it answered. Why would Victoria risk everything for a single piece of jewelry? Valuable as it was, she had access to plenty of royal jewels for official functions. The theft seemed almost personal, vindictive rather than simply acquisitive. Alexander spent the remainder of the day gathering information and building his case. He spoke with insurance experts who confirmed the ring's altered state would reduce its value from £2.3 million to perhaps £50,000. He reviewed Victoria's financial records, finding no obvious signs of debt or desperation. He even had palace security conduct a discreet search of her private chambers, which yielded nothing. As evening approached, Alexander made his decision. He would confront Victoria directly, but not privately. This was bigger than a family squabble. It was about the integrity of the monarchy itself. He arranged for the meeting to take place in the Blue Drawing Room, with Charlotte and Lord Chamberlain Blackwood as witnesses. When Victoria arrived for what she believed was a routine family dinner, she found herself facing not a social gathering, but a formal confrontation. Alexander had positioned himself behind his father's desk, with the altered ring displayed prominently on the polished wood surface. Charlotte sat to his right, her face a mask of controlled anger, while Blackwood stood near the door like a sentinel. "Please have a seat, Victoria," Alexander said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel that made the Duchess pause in the doorway. Victoria Ashworth was 42 years old, elegant in a way that only comes from generations of breeding and privilege. Her auburn hair was perfectly styled, her navy blue dress impeccably tailored, her jewelry understated but expensive. She had been a widow when she married King Harold, bringing with her a reputation for charity work and diplomatic grace. Looking at her now, Alexander found it hard to reconcile this poised woman with someone who would stoop to theft and vandalism. "Is something wrong?" Victoria asked, settling into the chair across from the desk with practiced composure. Her eyes flickered to the ring, and Alexander caught the barely perceptible tightening around her eyes. "You tell me," Alexander replied, lifting the Avalon sapphire ring and placing it in the center of the desk, where the light caught the synthetic stone. "Do you notice anything different about my mother's ring?" Victoria studied the jewelry with what appeared to be casual interest, but Alexander noticed her hands had gone completely still in her lap, a tell he had learned to recognize during years of diplomatic negotiations. "It's as beautiful as always," she said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Because according to 3 independent gemological experts, this ring has been deliberately altered. The original Ceylon sapphire has been removed and replaced with a synthetic stone. The setting has been modified, and the inscription has been partially destroyed." Alexander's voice remained level, but each word carried the weight of an accusation. The transformation in Victoria's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. The mask of polite confusion slipped just slightly, revealing something harder underneath. "That's a very serious allegation, Alexander. Are you suggesting someone in this palace is a thief?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating facts. The ring was altered, and the security footage shows you were the last person to access it in the vault. Alone, with opportunity and capability. Alexander leaned forward, his blue eyes fixed on Victoria's face. What I want to know is why. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the steady ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Victoria seemed to be weighing her options, calculating whether denial or confession would serve her better. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its warm, aristocratic charm. "You have no idea what it's like," she said quietly, "to live in the shadow of a dead woman who's been elevated to sainthood. Isabella this, Isabella that. Your father speaks of her constantly. The staff treats her memory like holy relics. And you children act as if no one could ever measure up to your precious mother's perfection." The raw bitterness in her voice caught Alexander off guard. This wasn't the polished duchess he had known for 3 years. This was someone who had been harboring deep resentment and pain. "So you decided to destroy her memory by vandalizing her jewelry?" Charlotte interjected, speaking for the first time since Victoria had entered the room. "I decided to claim what should rightfully be mine," Victoria shot back, her composure finally cracking completely. "I am the Queen Consort now. I should have access to the full royal collection, not be relegated to wearing Isabella's cast-offs while everyone whispers about how I don't compare to the beloved dead queen." The admission hung in the air like a toxin, poisoning any possibility of reconciliation. Alexander felt a complex mixture of anger and pity as he realized the depth of Victoria's insecurity and jealousy. But understanding her motivation didn't excuse her actions. "Where is the original sapphire?" he asked. Victoria's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Sold 3 weeks ago to a private collector in Dubai who specializes in historical gemstones. I needed the money for my own projects, my own legacy. I'm tired of being treated like a placeholder in your mother's kingdom." The finality of her words settled over the room, like a funeral shroud. The original stone was gone, irretrievable, lost forever to foreign hands. The Avalon sapphire, carrier of 7 generations of royal history, had been reduced to a mere transaction in Victoria's desperate attempt to establish her own importance. Alexander stood slowly, his decision crystallizing with each passing second. The woman sitting before him had not just committed theft. She had declared war on his family's heritage and his mother's memory. The consequences would be swift and severe, but first he needed to understand the full scope of her betrayal. "What else have you taken?" he asked quietly. Victoria's silence was answer enough. The dawn light filtering through the tall windows of Thornwick Palace cast long shadows across the blue drawing room as Alexander prepared for what would become the longest day of his royal career. The previous evening's confrontation with Victoria had ended with her admission of theft, but her silence regarding other potential crimes had left too many questions unanswered. Alexander had spent the sleepless night planning his next moves, knowing that each decision would have far-reaching consequences for the monarchy. Princess Charlotte arrived at 7 in the morning, carrying a leather portfolio filled with documentation from her investigation. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of the same sleepless night that had plagued her brother. As the royal family's unofficial expert on their historical collections, she had spent the dark hours conducting a preliminary inventory of other potentially compromised pieces. "I've identified at least 6 other items that require immediate expert examination," she announced, spreading photographs across the conference table that had been brought in for the emergency session. Mother's pearl and diamond tiara, the Empress Josephine bracelet, 2 sets of emerald earrings, and the ceremonial Order of the Golden Rose medallion. All pieces that Victoria has been photographed wearing at public events. Alexander studied the photographs with growing dismay. Each piece represented not just monetary value, but historical significance stretching back generations. The Empress Josephine bracelet alone had been a diplomatic gift from Napoleon III in 1855, while the Golden Rose medallion was traditionally worn only by queens during the most solemn state occasions.
"How extensive do you think this is?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. Based on her access patterns and the sophistication required for these alterations, I believe she's been planning this systematically for at least 18 months.
The modifications aren't random. They target the most historically significant pieces while leaving items with primarily monetary value untouched. It suggests she understood exactly what she was destroying. The implications made Alexander's blood run cold. This wasn't impulse or desperation. It was calculated cultural vandalism on a massive scale. Victoria had essentially been conducting a private war against his mother's legacy, one precious artifact at a time. Lord Chamberlain Blackwood entered the room carrying a thick folder of documents, his face grave with official concern. "Your Highness, I've completed the preliminary legal review. The situation is more complex than a simple theft case. Because Victoria acted in her capacity as queen consort with authorized access, the criminal charges would be difficult to prove in court. However, the breach of trust and violation of her ceremonial duties provide grounds for immediate action under royal prerogative. Alexander nodded, having anticipated this complication. The royal family operated under different legal frameworks than ordinary citizens, with traditions and precedents that stretched back centuries. What are our options? Immediate suspension of all royal privileges and access. Formal investigation by the Royal Household Security Division, and potential civil proceedings for recovery of assets. Additionally, there's the question of informing His Majesty the King, who has been travelling in Scotland and remains unaware of the situation. The mention of his father created another layer of complexity that Alexander had been avoiding. King Harold, at 68, had seemed genuinely happy for the first time since Isabella's death when he married Victoria. The revelation of her systematic theft and deception would devastate him, but delaying the inevitable would only make the eventual confrontation more painful. Schedule a secure call with my father for this afternoon, Alexander decided. He needs to hear this directly from us before any official actions are taken. In the meantime, I want Victoria's palace access suspended immediately and a comprehensive inventory of all potentially affected items. As Blackwood departed to implement these orders, Charlotte moved to the window overlooking the palace gardens where Victoria often took her morning walks. She's down there now, Charlotte observed, acting as if nothing has happened, greeting the staff, tending to her roses. It's almost sociopathic how normal she appears. Alexander joined his sister at the window, watching Victoria move through the garden with practiced grace. She wore a simple cream-colored dress and wide-brimmed hat, every inch the devoted royal spouse enjoying a peaceful morning. The contrast between this serene image and the calculating criminal they had confronted the night before was deeply unsettling. I keep thinking about the dinner parties, Charlotte continued, her voice thoughtful. All those times she wore mother's jewelry while hosting foreign dignitaries and charity events. She was literally displaying stolen property while representing our family's honor. The brazenness of it is staggering. The observation triggered a new concern in Alexander's mind. If Victoria had been wearing altered pieces during official state functions, the damage extended beyond personal theft into international embarrassment. Foreign leaders, museum curators, and jewelry experts around the world might have examined and photographed pieces they believed to be authentic royal treasures. We need to compile a complete record of every public appearance where she wore questionable pieces, he said grimly. The diplomatic implications could be enormous if word of this reaches the international community. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Alexander's private secretary, James Morrison, entered with an expression of barely controlled panic. Your Highness, we have a developing situation. The Duchess of Ravensholm has just departed the palace grounds without authorization, and she's taken several items from her personal quarters. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. In his focus on gathering evidence and building a legal case, he had underestimated Victoria's desperation and cunning. What kind of items? According to her lady-in-waiting, she packed 2 large suitcases and took several jewelry cases from her private safe. Lady Margaret tried to inquire about her destination, but the Duchess was evasive and seemed to be in considerable haste. Charlotte moved away from the window, her professional demeanor sharpening into focus. She's running. The question is whether she's trying to escape prosecution or destroy evidence. Either way, we need to act immediately. Alexander felt the weight of royal responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. Every decision from this point forward would be scrutinized by historians, legal experts, and the international media, but the immediate priority was clear. They needed to prevent Victoria from disappearing with whatever remaining royal artifacts she might possess. Contact the airport authorities and have her passport flagged, he commanded Morrison. Coordinate with palace security to determine exactly what she removed from her quarters. And get me a direct line to the Metropolitan Police. This is now officially a criminal investigation. As his staff scattered to implement emergency protocols, Alexander found himself alone with Charlotte in the room where their confrontation with Victoria had begun less than 12 hours earlier. The Avalon sapphire ring still sat on the conference table, its synthetic stone catching the morning light in a mockery of its former glory. I should have seen this coming, he said quietly, voicing the guilt that had been gnawing at him since the discovery. The signs were there, her obsession with royal protocol, her constant comparisons to Mother, the way she always seemed to be studying our family's history rather than simply living it. Charlotte placed a supportive hand on her brother's shoulder. She fooled everyone, Alexander. Father, the palace staff, the entire royal household. She came with impeccable references and convinced us all that she genuinely cared about serving the crown. None of us suspected she was systematically looting our heritage. The secure phone on the conference table rang with the distinctive tone reserved for emergency royal communications. Alexander answered to find Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Williams of the Metropolitan Police's Art and Antiques Unit on the line. Your Highness, we've been briefed on the situation by Lord Chamberlain Blackwood. I need to inform you that we've already initiated tracking protocols for the Duchess of Ravensholm. Her credit cards show recent activity at Heathrow Airport, and immigration records confirm she boarded a flight to Geneva approximately 2 hours ago. Geneva. Alexander's heart sank as he realized the implications. Switzerland's banking secrecy laws and complex extradition treaties would make recovering any assets or pursuing prosecution exponentially more difficult. Victoria had clearly planned this escape route well in advance. What about the items she took from the palace? He asked. We're coordinating with Swiss authorities, but the diplomatic complications are significant. As Queen Consort, she has certain immunities that complicate immediate action. However, we can pursue recovery through civil proceedings and international cooperation agreements. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with DCI Williams outlining the complex legal landscape surrounding royal theft cases. As Alexander listened to the procedural requirements and jurisdictional challenges, he realized that recovering the stolen artifacts would be a marathon rather than a sprint. When the call ended, Charlotte was reviewing security footage on her tablet, her expression growing increasingly grim. The inventory of her quarters reveals the scope of what we're dealing with, she said, turning the screen toward Alexander. Based on empty cases and missing items, we estimate she's taken at least 15 additional pieces beyond what we've already identified. Alexander studied the list of missing items, each one a replaceable piece of royal history. The monetary value was staggering, easily reaching into the tens of millions of pounds, but the cultural cost was immeasurable. Generations of royal heritage had been reduced to commodity transactions by someone who had sworn to protect and honor the monarchy. There's something else, Charlotte continued, her voice dropping to a whisper despite their privacy. I found correspondence in her desk that suggests this wasn't entirely a solo operation. There are letters from art dealers in Geneva, New York, and Hong Kong discussing unique acquisition opportunities and discreet private sales. She's been building a network of buyers for months, possibly years. The revelation that Victoria had accomplices in the international art market added new layers of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Professional art thieves operated in sophisticated networks with established methods for laundering stolen cultural artifacts through seemingly legitimate channels. Alexander moved to his father's desk, where generations of monarchs had faced their greatest challenges. The weight of tradition and responsibility felt heavier than ever as he contemplated the decisions that lay ahead. The monarchy's reputation for dignity and integrity was built on centuries of careful stewardship, and Victoria's betrayal threatened to undermine that foundation in a single scandal. We need to prepare for the possibility that this becomes public, he said, voicing the fear that had been growing since the discovery. If the media learns about systematic theft within the royal household, the damage to public confidence could be irreversible. Charlotte nodded grimly. The Republican movement has been gaining momentum in Parliament for months. This could provide them with exactly the ammunition they've been seeking to challenge the monarchy's relevance and trustworthiness. The irony wasn't lost on Alexander that his family's greatest internal threat in decades had come not from external Republicans or political opponents, but from someone who had been welcomed into their most intimate circle. Victoria had exploited their trust, their traditions, and their genuine affection to conduct what amounted to cultural terrorism from within. As afternoon approached, Alexander prepared for the conversation he had been dreading most, informing his father that his wife of 3 years was a criminal who had systematically robbed their family's heritage. King Harold, enjoying what he thought was a peaceful retreat in the Scottish Highlands, was about to receive news that would shatter his world and potentially change the course of the monarchy itself. The secure video connection flickered to life on the room's main screen, revealing King Harold seated in his study at Balmoral Castle. At 68, the king still carried himself with the dignity befitting his station, though Alexander could see the lines around his eyes had deepened since Isabella's death and his subsequent remarriage. Alexander, Charlotte, the king greeted them warmly. You both look terribly serious. I hope there's nothing wrong with the arrangements for the Commonwealth Summit next month. Alexander felt his throat constrict with the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. Father, we need to discuss a situation involving Victoria. Something has happened that requires your immediate attention and decision. The change in King Harold's expression was immediate and profound, the warmth leaving his eyes as he recognized the gravity in his son's voice. Tell me Everything, he said simply. Over the next hour, Alexander and Charlotte laid out the full scope of Victoria's betrayal, from the first discovery of the altered Avalon sapphire ring through her flight to Geneva that morning. They showed him the evidence, the security footage, the inventory of missing pieces, and the correspondence suggesting a broader criminal network. King Harold listened in complete silence, his face growing ashen as the magnitude of his wife's deception became clear. When they finished their presentation, the silence stretched for nearly a full minute before he finally spoke. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. "The discovery was made yesterday morning," Alexander replied. "We confronted her last evening and she admitted to the theft and sale of the original sapphire. And you're certain about the scope of this? 15 pieces, possibly more? The investigation is ongoing, but preliminary evidence suggests systematic theft over an extended period." "Father, I'm sorry, but this appears to be premeditated cultural vandalism, not opportunistic crime." King Harold seemed to age years in the space of moments, the weight of betrayal and public scandal settling on his shoulders like a visible burden. "What are our legal options?" "Limited, due to her status and location. But we can pursue civil recovery and work with international authorities. The immediate priority is damage control and securing any remaining assets." The king was quiet for another long moment, staring off camera toward the Scottish mountains that had provided him solace for so many years. When he finally looked back at the camera, his expression had hardened into the resolve that had guided him through decades of royal service. Issue formal revocation of all royal titles and privileges, effective immediately. Coordinate with our diplomatic corps to pursue every available legal remedy, and prepare a statement for release to the media. If this is going to become public, we control the narrative from the beginning. Alexander felt a surge of respect for his father's decisive response despite the personal pain the decision clearly caused. "Are you certain you want to move that quickly?"
"Alexander, your stepmother has stolen irreplaceable pieces of our national heritage and fled the country like a common criminal."
"Whatever personal feelings I may have are irrelevant compared to our duty to the crown and the people we serve. She has betrayed not just our family, but the institution of monarchy itself." The call ended with plans for King Harold's immediate return to London and a full emergency session of the Privy Council the following day. As the screen went dark, Alexander and Charlotte sat in contemplative silence, processing the reality that their family had just been irrevocably changed by one woman's greed and resentment. The afternoon sun was setting over London as news of Victoria's flight began to circulate through the highest levels of government and law enforcement. By evening, the story would begin its inexorable spread through diplomatic channels, international media, and the networks of art recovery specialists who dealt with stolen cultural treasures. Alexander stood once again at the tall windows of the blue drawing room, watching shadows lengthen across the palace grounds, where Victoria had walked that morning in apparent innocence. The gardens looked the same, but everything had changed. The monarchy would survive this crisis. It had weathered far worse storms over the centuries. But the scars would be permanent, and the questions about trust and vulnerability within their most sacred institutions would linger for years to come. The ornate chambers of Thornwick Palace had witnessed many crises throughout their centuries of service to the British monarchy, but few had carried the personal sting and institutional threat that now gripped the royal household. 3 days had passed since Victoria's flight to Geneva, and the carefully orchestrated investigation was revealing the true scope of her calculated campaign against the royal heritage. What had begun as the theft of a single ring had evolved into something approaching cultural warfare, conducted from within the very heart of the monarchy. Princess Charlotte had established what amounted to a war room in the East Wing's former ballroom, transforming the elegant space into a command center for art recovery operations. Tables covered with detailed photographs, authentication reports, and international correspondence stretched across the polished floors, while experts from Scotland Yard's Art and Antiques Unit worked alongside Swiss investigators and Interpol coordinators. "The Geneva connection is more extensive than we initially realized," announced Dr. Carpier, Marcus Finlay, the Royal Collection's chief curator, as he spread a new series of documents across the central table. "We've identified at least 3 separate storage facilities where Victoria maintained private collections, all registered under shell companies with Swiss bank financing." Alexander studied the aerial photographs of the storage facilities, their unremarkable exteriors hiding what international investigators now estimated could be millions of pounds worth of stolen royal artifacts. The systematic nature of Victoria's operation was becoming increasingly clear. This wasn't opportunistic theft, but a carefully planned cultural heist executed over years. "The financial trail is even more disturbing," added Detective Chief Inspector Williams, who had been coordinating with Swiss authorities since Victoria's flight.
Bank records show regular deposits consistent with high-value art sales going back 28 months.
She's been systematically liquidating royal heritage and building substantial private wealth in offshore accounts. Charlotte looked up from her examination of authentication reports, her expert eye having identified patterns that painted an even grimmer picture. The pieces she chose to steal weren't random. Every item had specific historical significance beyond its monetary value. The Empress Josephine bracelet, the Ceylon sapphire from the Avalon ring, the pearls from Queen Adelaide's collection. These represented key moments in royal history, symbolic links to our institutional continuity. The observation struck Alexander with particular force because it revealed the true nature of Victoria's crimes. She hadn't simply stolen valuable objects, she had deliberately targeted the artifacts that formed the cultural DNA of the monarchy, the physical manifestations of centuries of tradition and continuity. "It's cultural terrorism," he said quietly, voicing what everyone in the room had been thinking but hadn't dared to articulate. She wasn't just enriching herself, she was systematically destroying our historical identity. King Harold, who had returned from Scotland the previous day looking years older than when he had departed, entered the makeshift command centre with Lord Chamberlain Blackwood and several members of the Privy Council. The king's expression was grimmer than Alexander had ever seen, the weight of personal betrayal compounded by the magnitude of institutional damage. "Bring me up to date on the recovery efforts," he commanded, settling into the chair that had been prepared for him at the head of the central table. DCI Williams consulted her tablet before delivering the sobering update. Swiss authorities have secured 3 storage facilities and frozen associated bank accounts pending legal proceedings. However, the diplomatic complications are significant. As a former Queen consort, Victoria retains certain immunities that complicate direct prosecution, and Swiss banking laws provide additional layers of protection. "What about the buyers?" Charlotte asked. "The correspondence we found suggests a network of private collectors who may not have known they were purchasing stolen artifacts. That's where it gets complex." "Doctor," Finlay replied, spreading a world map across the table with colored pins marking known transaction locations. "We've identified sales in Dubai, Hong Kong, New York, and private collectors throughout Europe. Some buyers appear to have been legitimate if naive collectors, but others clearly knew they were acquiring questionable artifacts." Alexander studied the map, realizing that recovering the stolen pieces would require coordination with law enforcement and cultural authorities across multiple continents. Each jurisdiction would have different laws regarding stolen art, international recovery, and diplomatic immunity. "The media situation is becoming our immediate priority," announced Sir Geoffrey Whitman, the palace's director of communications, entering with a stack of morning newspapers from around the world. "The story has begun to leak despite our efforts at containment. The Evening Standard is preparing a full exposé for tomorrow's edition." The newspapers Sir Geoffrey spread across the table told a story of growing international interest and speculation. Headlines range from the sensational royal family rocked by theft scandal to the more measured questions raised about palace security following heritage losses. Several international publications had already begun connecting Victoria's flight to broader questions about the monarchy's relevance and management of national treasures. King Harold examined the headlines with the stoic expression he had developed over decades of navigating media storms. "We release our own statement today, before the speculation becomes uncontrollable. Full disclosure of the theft, our recovery efforts, and our commitment to protecting royal heritage. We control this narrative or it controls us." Alexander felt a surge of pride at his father's decisive response despite the personal cost. Rather than attempting damage control or minimizing the scandal, the king was choosing complete transparency, a risk that could either restore public confidence or further damage the monarchy's reputation. "There's another complication," Charlotte said quietly, producing a leather portfolio from her investigation materials. "I've discovered evidence that Victoria may have had advanced knowledge of certain pieces' historical significance that wasn't widely available. Someone with expert knowledge of our collections provided her with detailed information about the most valuable and historically significant items." The implication of Charlotte's words created a stunned silence in the room. If Victoria had inside help from someone with privileged access to royal historical records, the betrayal extended even deeper into the monarchy's trusted circle. "What kind of information?" King Harold asked, though his tone suggested he dreaded the answer. Charlotte opened the portfolio to reveal photocopied pages covered with detailed notes about individual artifacts, manufacturing techniques, historical provenance, estimated values, and specific details about storage locations within the palace vault. This level of detail could only come from someone with academic expertise and sustained access to our private archives. The handwriting analysis suggests multiple contributors. Detective Chief Inspector Williams leaned forward to examine the documents. If we're looking at a broader conspiracy involving palace staff or external experts, this becomes a national security issue beyond simple theft. We're talking about systematic penetration of one of Britain's most secure cultural institutions. Alexander felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as the scope of the betrayal continued to expand. What had begun as his stepmother's personal vendetta against his mother's memory was revealing itself as potentially the largest security breach in royal history, with implications that stretched far beyond stolen jewelry. "I want polygraph examinations for everyone with vault access over the past 3 years," he commanded. "Full background investigations, financial audits, the works. If there are other conspirators within our household, we find them." As the meeting continued into the afternoon, each new piece of evidence painted a more disturbing picture of institutional vulnerability and systematic exploitation. Victoria had not simply stolen artifacts. She had exposed fundamental weaknesses in systems designed to protect Britain's most precious cultural treasures. The afternoon brought news that would further complicate the international recovery effort. Swiss investigators had discovered that several of Victoria's storage facilities had been emptied in the hours immediately following her arrival in Geneva. Professional art movers had systematically transferred the contents to unknown locations, suggesting the existence of predetermined escape plans and alternative storage networks. "She's activated contingency protocols," Dr. Finlay observed grimly. "This level of operational security suggests professional guidance, possibly from organized crime networks specializing in stolen art. The connection to professional art thieves opened new and darker possibilities that extended far beyond royal scandal into the realm of international criminal activity. If Victoria had been working with established networks of cultural artifact smugglers, the stolen pieces could have already been moved across multiple borders and integrated into the underground art market. The insurance implications alone are staggering," noted Sir James Pemberton, the royal household's financial advisor. "We're looking at potential claims exceeding £50 million, and that's assuming we can establish clear ownership chains for pieces that may have been altered or had their provenance deliberately obscured." As evening approached, Alexander found himself once again standing at the windows of the blue drawing room. But now the view carried entirely different significance. The gardens where Victoria had walked in apparent innocence just days before had become a crime scene in his mind, every memory tainted by the knowledge of her deception and calculation. Charlotte joined him at the window, carrying the Avalon sapphire ring in its evidence bag. The synthetic replacement stone caught the light with a cold brilliance that seemed to mock the warm fire of the original Ceylon sapphire, now lost forever to private collectors. "I keep thinking about the dinner party last month," she said quietly. "Victoria wearing mother's pearl tiara while hosting the French ambassador's reception. She was literally displaying stolen property while representing our family's honor to foreign dignitaries. The brazenness is almost incomprehensible." The observation triggered another uncomfortable realization for Alexander. If Victoria had been wearing altered or stolen pieces during official state functions, the diplomatic embarrassment extended beyond theft into questions of authenticity and trust that could damage Britain's cultural relationships with other nations. "We need to compile a complete record of every public appearance where she wore questionable pieces," he said, voicing a concern that had been growing throughout the day. "The Commonwealth Summit next month includes exhibitions of royal treasures. If any of those pieces were part of Victoria's scheme, we could face international humiliation." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an encrypted communication from the British Embassy in Bern, delivered by secure courier and marked with the highest priority classifications. Lord Chamberlain Blackwood brought the sealed packet directly to King Harold, who read its contents with an expression of growing disbelief. "Victoria has released a public statement to Swiss media," the king announced to the assembled group. "She's claiming that she was protecting royal artifacts from neglect and mismanagement within the palace, and that her actions were motivated by concern for preserving British cultural heritage. The audacity of Victoria's claim, positioning herself as a protector rather than a destroyer of royal heritage, represented a new level of psychological manipulation that caught everyone off guard. By framing her theft as preservation, she was attempting to turn public opinion against the royal family's stewardship of their own collections. She's going on the offensive, Sir Geoffrey Whitman observed grimly. This statement suggests she's planning a media campaign to justify her actions and potentially embarrass the royal family further. We need to respond immediately and definitively. Alexander felt a cold anger building as he contemplated Victoria's strategy. Not content with stealing irreplaceable artifacts, she was now attempting to destroy his family's reputation through calculated public relations manipulation. The woman who had sat at their dinner table, shared their private moments, and been trusted with their most intimate family traditions, was waging psychological warfare against everything they represented. "We accelerate our timeline," King Harold declared with steel in his voice. "Full public disclosure tomorrow morning, complete transparency about the investigation, and categorical refutation of any claims about palace mismanagement. We take control of this narrative before she can establish her version of events." As the day ended with frantic preparations for the next morning's press conference, Alexander realized that the battle for the monarchy's reputation was just beginning. Victoria's flight had marked the end of the theft phase of her campaign, but the beginning of what promised to be a protracted war for public opinion and institutional credibility. The stolen artifacts were just the physical manifestation of a deeper attack on the monarchy's cultural authority and moral legitimacy. Recovery of the missing pieces would be important, but restoring public confidence in the royal family's ability to protect and preserve Britain's heritage would be the greater challenge. Standing in the palace that had been his home for 35 years, Alexander felt the weight of centuries of royal responsibility settling on his shoulders. The throne he would someday inherit had been scarred by betrayal from within, and rebuilding the trust that Victoria had systematically destroyed would become one of the defining challenges of his future reign. The ancient stones of Thornwick Palace had witnessed many storms throughout their long service to the British monarchy, but few had struck so close to the heart of what the institution represented. As Alexander prepared for the media battles ahead, he drew strength from the knowledge that the monarchy had survived far greater challenges over the centuries, and that truth and transparency would ultimately prevail over manipulation and deceit. The war for Britain's cultural heritage and royal legitimacy was about to begin in earnest, fought not with swords or armies, but with evidence, integrity, and the unwavering determination to protect the institutional foundations that had served the nation for over a millennium. The morning of the royal family's public response dawned grey and forbidding over London, as if the weather itself reflected the gravity of what was about to unfold. Thornwick Palace, normally a bastion of controlled dignity and measured communication, had been transformed overnight into the nerve center of one of the most complex media operations in royal history. The ancient corridors buzzed with unprecedented activity as communications specialists, legal advisors, and security experts prepared for what would either restore public confidence or potentially devastate the monarchy's reputation. Alexander stood in his father's private study, reviewing the final draft of the statement that would soon be delivered to a watching world. The document represented hours of careful crafting by the palace's finest legal and communications minds, balancing the need for complete transparency with the requirements of ongoing criminal investigations. Every word had been scrutinized, every phrase calibrated to convey both accountability and strength. The Swiss media response to Victoria's statement has been significant, reported Sir Geoffrey Whitman, entering with translations of overnight coverage from European newspapers. She's managed to frame herself as a whistleblower exposing royal mismanagement, and several outlets are treating her claims as credible, pending our response. Alexander studied the translated headlines with growing dismay. Former Queen Consort reveals palace security failures, read one prominent Swiss publication, while a German newspaper had run with British royal treasures neglected insider claims. Victoria's calculated media strategy was already bearing fruit, creating doubt about the royal family's competence before they had a chance to present their side of the story. "There's more," Sir Geoffrey continued grimly. "She scheduled a television interview with Swiss International Broadcasting for this afternoon. Our sources suggest she's prepared to make specific allegations about inadequate conservation practices and security vulnerabilities within the palace vault system." The revelation that Victoria was planning a full media offensive struck Alexander like a physical blow. Her strategy was becoming clear. Rather than simply fleeing with stolen artifacts, she intended to wage a public relations war designed to justify her actions while simultaneously destroying the royal family's credibility as stewards of British heritage. Princess Charlotte entered the study carrying a tablet displaying the morning's social media analytics, her expression reflecting the severity of their digital challenges. The online response has been swift and polarized. #royal theft is trending globally, but the conversation is split between those demanding accountability and those questioning whether Victoria's claims have merit. Alexander examined the social media dashboard, watching real-time sentiment analysis fluctuate as news of the scandal spread across international platforms. The monarchy's digital reputation, carefully cultivated over years of strategic engagement, was being systematically undermined by speculation and misinformation. "What's our digital response strategy?" he asked, recognizing that the battle for public opinion would be fought as much online as in traditional media. "Coordinated release across all platforms simultaneously with the press conference," Charlotte replied. "Full documentation, photographic evidence of the thefts, and video testimonials from authentication experts. We overwhelm the speculation with facts and evidence." King Harold entered the study precisely at 9 o'clock, his bearing reflecting the military discipline that had served him throughout decades of royal service. Despite the personal devastation of Victoria's betrayal, he carried himself with the unwavering dignity that the institution demanded during its greatest challenges. "Status report on the international investigation," he commanded, settling into the chair behind his desk where so many crucial royal decisions had been made over the centuries. Detective Chief Inspector Williams, who had remained at the palace overnight coordinating with Swiss authorities, consulted her secure communications device before delivering the latest updates. Swiss police have confirmed that Victoria's storage facilities were systematically emptied using professional art transport services. The operation was clearly planned well in advance with specialized climate-controlled vehicles and expert handling protocols.
What about the buyer network? Alexander asked, though he suspected the answer would further complicate their recovery efforts.
Interpol has identified transactions with collectors in 7 different countries, but the trail becomes murky due to shell companies and cryptocurrency payments. Several pieces may have already been integrated into private collections, or even legitimate museum acquisitions, through forged documentation. The revelation that some stolen artifacts might have entered legitimate institutions through falsified provenance created an entirely new category of diplomatic and legal challenges. Museums and collectors who had unknowingly acquired stolen royal treasures would need to be approached with extraordinary delicacy to avoid international incidents. "The insurance investigation has revealed additional concerns," added Sir James Pemberton, reviewing financial documents that had been compiled overnight. "Victoria had been systematically photographing our collections for months, creating detailed catalogues that would be invaluable for establishing replacement values or creating convincing forgeries." Alexander felt a chill as he contemplated the possibility that some recovered pieces might actually be high-quality reproductions, while the originals remained lost in private collections. Victoria's systematic documentation suggested a level of criminal sophistication that extended far beyond opportunistic theft. Lord Chamberlain Blackwood entered carrying the results of the internal security investigation that had been ongoing since Victoria's flight. His expression was grave as he prepared to deliver findings that would further shake the foundation of trust within the royal household. "The polygraph examinations and background investigations have yielded disturbing results," he announced solemnly. 2 staff members with vault access showed deceptive responses regarding their knowledge of Victoria's activities, and financial audits have revealed unexplained deposits in their personal accounts. The confirmation of inside assistance struck Alexander with the force of a second betrayal. The idea that trusted palace staff, people who had sworn oaths of loyalty and discretion, had been complicit in the systematic theft of royal heritage represented a fundamental breach of institutional security. "Who?" King Harold asked quietly, though his tone carried the weight of absolute authority. "Assistant Curator Dr. Kopp, Helena Morrison, and Archive Specialist Thomas Whitfield. Both have been with the royal household for over a decade. Both had extensive access to collection documentation, and both maintained regular contact with Victoria during the period of the thefts." Alexander recognized both names immediately. Dr. Texar. Morrison had been his mother's trusted advisor on collection matters, while Whitfield had been responsible for maintaining the detailed historical records that made the Royal Archives among the world's finest cultural resources. Their betrayal represented not just criminal activity, but the corruption of institutional knowledge and trust. "Have they been arrested?" Charlotte asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They're currently being questioned by the Metropolitan Police's Special Branch," DCI Williams confirmed. "Their cooperation with the investigation will determine the charges they face, but preliminary evidence suggests active participation in identifying and documenting target pieces for theft." As the morning progressed toward the scheduled press conference, Alexander found himself grappling with the realization that the crisis extended far beyond Victoria's individual crimes. The systematic nature of the conspiracy, involving trusted insiders and international criminal networks, suggested institutional vulnerabilities that would require fundamental reforms to address. "We need to discuss the long-term implications," he said, addressing the assembled group of advisors and investigators. "Even if we recover every stolen piece, the damage to public confidence in our ability to protect cultural heritage could be permanent. We need a comprehensive response that addresses not just this specific crime, but the broader questions about royal stewardship that Victoria's actions have raised." Sir Geoffrey Whitman nodded grimly. The media narrative is already evolving beyond simple theft toward questions about the monarchy's competence and transparency. Victoria's claims about inadequate conservation and security are resonating with Republican voices who have been seeking ammunition against the institution. The observation highlighted the broader political context that surrounded the scandal. The royal family's critics had long argued that national treasures should be held in public institutions rather than private royal collections, and Victoria's theft provided apparent evidence for their position. "What's our position on enhanced oversight and public access?" Alexander asked, recognizing that some concessions might be necessary to maintain public support. King Harold considered the question carefully before responding. "We propose the establishment of an independent Royal Heritage Commission with public oversight of our collections, enhanced security protocols developed in partnership with national museums, and increased public access to royal treasures through traveling exhibitions and digital archives." The proposal represented a significant shift toward greater transparency and public accountability, acknowledging that the monarchy's role as custodian of national heritage required public trust and confidence. While painful, the reforms could ultimately strengthen the institution's legitimacy, while better protecting cultural treasures. As noon approached, final preparations for the press conference entered their most critical phase. The main stateroom had been configured with appropriate lighting and audio systems to accommodate the international media presence that had gathered at Thornwick Palace. Representatives from major news organizations worldwide had assembled to witness what many were already calling the most significant royal scandal in decades. Alexander reviewed his speaking notes one final time, knowing that his words would be analyzed by historians, legal experts, and political commentators for years to come. The prepared statement struck a careful balance between accepting responsibility for security failures while firmly rejecting any suggestion that the royal family had been negligent in their stewardship of national treasures. "Remember that this is about more than just our family's reputation," King Harold advised as they prepared to enter the stateroom. "We're defending the principle that cultural heritage can be safely maintained through traditional institutions, and that temporary setbacks don't invalidate centuries of successful preservation." Charlotte joined them carrying the evidence portfolio that would support their public presentation, including photographs of the stolen pieces, authentication reports proving the alterations, and documentation of the recovery efforts. The visual evidence would be crucial for establishing credibility and countering Victoria's alternative narrative. "The Swiss interview is scheduled to broadcast just hours after our statement," she reminded them. "Victoria will have the opportunity to respond directly to our claims, so we need to ensure our evidence is absolutely bulletproof." As they approached the stateroom where dozens of cameras and international media representatives waited, Alexander felt the weight of institutional history settling on his shoulders. The monarchy had survived constitutional crises, world wars, and social upheavals, but had rarely faced such direct challenges to its cultural authority and moral legitimacy. The double doors to the stateroom opened to reveal a sea of cameras, lights, and expectant faces representing media outlets from around the globe. The visual spectacle of modern journalism filling one of Britain's most historic spaces created a striking juxtaposition between ancient tradition and contemporary scrutiny. King Harold approached the podium with the measured dignity that had characterized his entire reign, carrying himself as both a grieving husband and a monarch responsible for protecting national interests. The room fell silent as he began to speak, his words carrying across the assembled media and, through them, to audiences around the world. "Today, I address you regarding a matter that strikes at the heart of our monarchy's responsibility as custodians of British cultural heritage," he began, his voice steady despite the personal cost of the revelations he was about to make. "We have discovered that systematic theft of irreplaceable royal artifacts has been conducted by individuals who were trusted with access to our most precious collections. The formal acknowledgement of criminal activity within the royal household created an immediate stir among the assembled media, cameras clicking and digital recorders capturing every nuance of the king's delivery." Alexander watched the reporters' faces, seeing mixtures of surprise, satisfaction, and intense concentration as they processed the historic admission. "The investigation has revealed that Victoria Ashworth, the former Duchess of Ravensholm, conducted a systematic campaign of theft targeting artifacts of particular historical significance to the British monarchy. She was assisted in these crimes by individuals within our household who violated their oaths of loyalty and their responsibility to protect our national heritage." As King Harold continued his statement, providing specific details about the stolen pieces, the evidence of systematic criminal activity, and the ongoing recovery efforts, Alexander observed the media response with growing confidence that their transparency strategy had been correct. Rather than attempting to minimize or conceal the scandal, they were presenting complete information and accepting responsibility while firmly establishing the criminal nature of Victoria's actions. We acknowledge that this betrayal of trust has revealed security vulnerabilities that must be addressed, the King continued, outlining the proposed reforms and enhanced oversight measures. However, we categorically reject any suggestion that these criminal acts reflect negligence or incompetence in our stewardship of cultural treasures. The press conference continued for nearly an hour, with detailed presentations of evidence, expert testimony from authentication specialists, and comprehensive answers to media questions. By its conclusion, Alexander felt confident that they had successfully established both the criminal nature of Victoria's actions and the royal family's commitment to transparency and accountability. But as they departed the stateroom, they knew the real battle was just beginning. Victoria's Swiss television interview would broadcast within hours, and her response to their public statement would determine whether their transparency strategy had successfully controlled the narrative or simply provided her with additional ammunition for her public relations offensive. The monarchy's reputation, built over centuries of service and tradition, now hung in the balance between competing narratives about duty, betrayal, and the proper stewardship of national heritage. The outcome would determine not just the resolution of this particular scandal, but the future legitimacy of the royal family as guardians of British cultural treasures. The aftermath of the royal family's unprecedented public disclosure reverberated through international media networks like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Within hours of King Harold's press conference, news organizations across the globe were dissecting every detail of the scandal, while legal experts, art historians, and political commentators offered their analyses of what many were already calling the most significant royal crisis in modern British history. The transparency strategy had succeeded in establishing the royal family's credibility, but Victoria's imminent television interview promised to complicate the narrative in ways that could prove devastating. Alexander monitored the global media response from the secure communications center that had been established in Thornwick Palace's East Wing, watching real-time sentiment analysis shift as international coverage evolved throughout the day. The initial reaction had been largely supportive of the royal family's forthright approach, but underlying currents of doubt about institutional competence remained problematic. The European media response has been generally favourable, reported Sir Geoffrey Whitman, reviewing overnight coverage from major continental publications. French and German outlets are treating this as a criminal matter rather than a royal scandal, which suggests our evidence presentation was effective. However, the Swiss Broadcasting Corporation has been promoting Victoria's interview as a major exposé that will challenge our version of events. Princess Charlotte looked up from her tablet where she had been monitoring social media analytics and online public opinion. The digital conversation is more nuanced than traditional media coverage. While most people accept the criminal charges, there's growing discussion about whether the royal family should maintain private collections of national treasures at all. Victoria's theft has inadvertently sparked a broader debate about cultural heritage management. The observation struck at the heart of Alexander's deepest concerns about the scandal's long-term implications. Even if they successfully prosecuted Victoria and recovered the stolen artifacts, the damage to public confidence in royal stewardship might prove irreversible. Republican voices in Parliament had already begun calling for the transfer of royal collections to public museums, arguing that private custody created unacceptable security risks. Detective Chief Inspector Williams entered the communications center carrying encrypted updates from Swiss authorities that would soon test the effectiveness of their international cooperation efforts. Geneva police have made significant progress in tracing Victoria's network, but the findings are more complex than we anticipated, she announced grimly. What kind of complexity? King Harold asked, though his tone suggested he was prepared for additional bad news. Victoria's operation appears to have been part of a larger criminal enterprise specializing in high-value cultural artifact theft. The Swiss investigation has uncovered connections to similar thefts from private collections in France, Italy, and Germany over the past 5 years. She wasn't working alone. She was part of an international network that specifically targets aristocratic and royal collections. The revelation that Victoria's crimes were connected to a broader criminal organization added entirely new dimensions to the scandal that extended far beyond personal betrayal into questions of national security and international law enforcement cooperation. If the theft had been part of a systematic campaign against European cultural heritage, the implications stretched across multiple governments and law enforcement agencies. How extensive is this network? Alexander asked, though he suspected the answer would further complicate their recovery efforts. Interpol has identified at least 12 similar operations targeting private heritage collections across Europe. DCI Williams replied, consulting her secure tablet. The pattern suggests highly sophisticated advanced intelligence, professional execution, and established channels for laundering stolen artifacts through legitimate art markets. Charlotte studied the criminal network analysis with her expert eye for detail, recognizing patterns that connected to suspicious activities she had observed during her own investigation of the royal collections. This explains how Victoria knew exactly which pieces to target, she observed. The network must have provided detailed intelligence about the most valuable and historically significant items in our collections. The realization that criminal organizations had been systematically gathering intelligence about royal treasures for years created profound security implications that extended beyond the immediate theft. If professional networks had detailed knowledge of the palace's most precious artifacts, additional crimes were not just possible, but probable. Lord Chamberlain Blackwood entered carrying the results of the expanded internal investigation that had been ongoing since the discovery of staff complicity in Victoria's crimes. The security review has identified systemic vulnerabilities that require immediate attention, he reported with characteristic understatement. How systemic? King Harold asked, though his expression suggested he was steeling himself for comprehensive bad news. Our access control systems, documentation procedures, and authentication protocols were all compromised by the criminal network. The investigation suggests that intelligence gathering about our collections has been ongoing for at least 3 years, possibly longer. Alexander felt a cold fury building as he contemplated the scope of the institutional penetration that Victoria's crimes had revealed. The royal family's most trusted systems, developed over centuries to protect irreplaceable cultural treasures, had been systematically compromised by criminals who had exploited their generosity and openness. As afternoon approached, Swiss International Broadcasting began promoting Victoria's interview with increasing intensity, releasing preview clips that suggested she would make explosive allegations about palace mismanagement and security failures.
The promotional materials portrayed her as a courageous whistleblower, exposing dangerous neglect of priceless cultural artifacts.
She's prepared to present specific examples of inadequate conservation and security, Sir Geoffrey warned, reviewing the interview previews that had been released to international media. Her claims include assertions that several pieces were deteriorating due to improper storage conditions and that the vault security systems were outdated and vulnerable to penetration. Alexander studied the preview materials with growing apprehension, recognizing that Victoria's strategy was sophisticated and potentially effective. By combining legitimate concerns about heritage preservation with false narratives about neglect, she was creating doubt about royal competence while positioning herself as a protector of cultural treasures. What's our response strategy? He asked, knowing that their reaction to her allegations would be crucial for maintaining public confidence. Complete transparency and immediate access for independent experts, King Harold declared with decisive authority. We invite UNESCO representatives, international museum professionals, and heritage conservation specialists to conduct comprehensive evaluations of our collections and security systems. If Victoria wants to challenge our stewardship, we'll subject ourselves to the most rigorous international scrutiny available. The proposal to invite external evaluation represented a dramatic shift toward unprecedented transparency and accountability, acknowledging that the monarchy's role as cultural custodian required public validation and trust. While potentially risky, the strategy could ultimately strengthen the institution's legitimacy while providing definitive refutation of Victoria's claims. At 6 o'clock London time, Victoria's interview began broadcasting across European networks, with English translation provided through satellite feeds to international audiences. Alexander and the royal family gathered in the secure viewing room to witness what promised to be either their vindication or their further humiliation. Victoria appeared on screen dressed in elegant but understated clothing, her demeanor projecting sincerity and concern rather than the calculating manipulation they had witnessed during their private confrontation. The Swiss interviewer's questions were respectful but probing, creating an atmosphere of serious journalism rather than sensational entertainment. I want to be clear that my actions were never about personal enrichment, Victoria began, her voice carrying conviction that might have been persuasive to viewers unfamiliar with the evidence. I became increasingly concerned about the deteriorating condition of irreplaceable artifacts and the inadequate security measures protecting them. When my private expressions of concern were ignored, I felt compelled to take action to preserve these treasures for future generations. Alexander watched with grudging admiration as Victoria presented her narrative with sophisticated psychological manipulation, combining partial truths with complete fabrications, in ways that created doubt about the royal family's competence. Her claims about conservation concerns contained just enough technical detail to sound credible to non-expert audiences. The palace vault systems were installed in the 1970s and have never been significantly upgraded, she continued, providing specific details that suggested insider knowledge. Climate control was inconsistent, authentication procedures were informal, and access controls relied on outdated mechanical systems rather than modern biometric security. The allegations were devastating not because they were entirely false, but because they contained enough truth to create credibility while exaggerating problems into crisis. The royal family's approach to security had indeed emphasized tradition and discretion over high-tech solutions, creating vulnerabilities that Victoria was now exploiting for public relations advantage. "What about the specific items you removed from the palace?" the interviewer asked directly, challenging Victoria to justify the criminal aspects of her actions. "I carefully selected pieces that were showing signs of deterioration or that I believed were at risk," she replied smoothly. "My intention was always to have them professionally conserved and restored, then returned to proper custody. The criminal charges represent a fundamental misunderstanding of my motivations and actions." Charlotte shook her head in disbelief at Victoria's brazen reinterpretation of documented theft as conservation heroism. "She's claiming she intended to return the pieces after professional restoration? That's completely contradicted by the sales evidence we've documented." As the interview continued for nearly an hour, Victoria presented a carefully crafted narrative that portrayed her as a concerned conservator, whose good intentions had been criminalized by an embarrassed royal family seeking to cover up their institutional failures. The performance was sophisticated, emotionally compelling, and potentially devastating to public confidence in royal stewardship. When the interview concluded, the immediate media response was swift and polarized. European outlets generally treated Victoria's claims with appropriate skepticism, recognizing the self-serving nature of her narrative. However, British Republican voices and some international commentators began using her allegations to support broader arguments about the inappropriateness of private royal custody of national treasures. "The damage assessment will take days to complete," Sir Geoffrey observed grimly. "But the interview has definitely complicated our narrative control. She's managed to create reasonable doubt about our competence, while positioning herself as a misunderstood protector of cultural heritage." Alexander felt the weight of institutional responsibility as he contemplated the long-term implications of Victoria's public relations offensive. The monarchy's legitimacy as cultural custodian was now subject to international scrutiny and debate, requiring not just legal vindication, but comprehensive demonstration of competence and transparency. "We implement the UNESCO evaluation immediately," King Harold declared with finality. "Complete international oversight of our collections, security systems, and conservation practices. We turn Victoria's challenge into an opportunity to demonstrate that traditional stewardship can meet the highest modern standards." As evening approached, preliminary reports from Swiss law enforcement provided the first concrete evidence that would ultimately expose Victoria's narrative as elaborate deception. Geneva police had discovered detailed financial records proving that the conservation she claimed had motivated her actions was actually systematic liquidation for personal profit. The Swiss investigation has uncovered bank records showing direct deposits from art dealers totaling over £8 million, DCI Williams announced. These transactions correspond exactly to the time frame of the thefts, completely contradicting her claims about conservation motivation. The financial evidence provided the definitive proof needed to refute Victoria's public narrative, but Alexander recognized that legal vindication might come too late to repair the damage to public confidence. The battle for the monarchy's reputation would require not just proving Victoria's guilt, but demonstrating institutional commitment to the highest standards of cultural stewardship. Over the following weeks, as UNESCO experts conducted comprehensive evaluations of royal collections and Swiss authorities built their criminal case, the scandal gradually evolved from crisis toward resolution. The international evaluation process, while initially threatening, ultimately provided powerful validation of the royal family's stewardship practices and exposed Victoria's allegations as largely unfounded. "The UNESCO report is unequivocal," announced Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the organization's chief cultural heritage specialist, during a press conference 6 weeks after Victoria's flight. "The royal collections are maintained to the highest international standards, with conservation practices that exceed most national museums. The security systems, while traditional in approach, provide effective protection appropriate to the threat environment." The vindication was comprehensive and decisive, but Alexander understood that rebuilding public trust would require ongoing commitment to transparency and accountability. The monarchy's approach to cultural stewardship had been permanently changed by Victoria's betrayal, with new systems of oversight and public access that strengthened rather than weakened the institution. 3 months later, when Victoria was finally extradited from Switzerland to face criminal charges in British courts, the royal family had not only survived the crisis but emerged with enhanced legitimacy and public confidence. The stolen artifacts were gradually recovered through international cooperation, while the exposure of the criminal network prevented similar crimes against other cultural institutions. Standing once again at the windows of Thornwick Palace, Alexander watched autumn sunlight illuminate the gardens where Victoria had once walked in apparent innocence. The monarchy had weathered its greatest challenge in decades, emerging stronger and more transparent than before. The price had been enormous: personal betrayal, international embarrassment, and fundamental changes to centuries of tradition. But the institution's survival and renewal proved the enduring strength of constitutional monarchy in adapting to contemporary challenges. The Avalon sapphire ring, eventually recovered from a private collector in Hong Kong, was restored to its original magnificence through painstaking conservation work. When Alexander finally placed it in the hands of his future bride several years later, it carried not just the beauty and history of 7 royal generations, but the hard-won knowledge that protecting cultural heritage required eternal vigilance against those who would exploit trust for personal gain. The scandal that had threatened to destroy the monarchy's credibility ultimately became a testament to the power of transparency, accountability, and institutional resilience in the face of betrayal. Victoria's attempt to destroy the royal family's cultural authority had instead strengthened it, proving that even the most sophisticated deception cannot ultimately prevail against truth and genuine commitment to public service.